You sit down at the closing table, you sign a note for $300,000, and naturally, you might walk away believing, the lender extended $300,000 of credit for my use. But Regulation Z forces us to ask a much more precise question. How much credit did you actually receive? Because the number written on the note and the regulatory concept called the amount financed are not necessarily the same thing. This distinction is critical. The note amount is one concept, the proceeds of the transaction may be another, and the amount financed disclosed under Regulation Z has its own regulatory calculation. They should not simply be treated as interchangeable numbers. That means the consumer should not stop the analysis merely because a promissory note displays a large principal figure. The disclosure calculation deserves its own examination. Under Regulation Z, the amount financed is designed to identify the amount of credit determined under the regulation's calculation rules. In practical terms, it helps answer a powerful consumer question. After accounting for the relevant components of this credit transaction, what amount is being disclosed as financed? That question matters because certain charges associated with obtaining credit can affect the calculation. Think of the transaction as something that can be taken apart. Instead of looking only at the headline number, examine the components beneath it. What amounts entered the obligation? Which amounts qualify as finance charges? Which of those charges were prepaid finance charges? Which amounts are included in the amount financed under Regulation Z? And ultimately, does the disclosed amount financed reconcile with the underlying transaction? Now we are conducting an audit instead of merely reading a number. Suppose the face amount of the note is $300,000. That does not end the inquiry. If the transaction contains charges that Regulation Z requires to be treated as prepaid finance charges, those amounts can reduce the amount financed. So the analytical framework may look like this. Amount of credit, from which the calculation begins, minus applicable prepaid finance charges, plus or minus other amounts required by Regulation Z, equals amount financed. The exact calculation depends on the transaction. That is why simply subtracting every finance charge from the note amount can produce the wrong answer. Here is an important distinction. Do not automatically assume. Note, amount minus every finance charge equals amount financed. Regulation Z's calculation is more specific than that. A finance charge identifies the cost of consumer credit as defined by the regulation. A prepaid finance charge is a finance charge paid separately in cash or by check before or at consummation, or withheld from the proceeds of the credit at any time. That classification can directly affect the amount finance calculation. So the real question is not merely, was there a charge? It is, how does Regulation Z classify that charge, and where does that classification place it in the calculation? Consider the example from the material. The note is $5,435, but after applying the appropriate Regulation Z calculations, the disclosed amount financed is $4,975. Think about what that demonstrates. The face amount of the obligation and the amount financed can be different. That difference is not something the consumer should simply ignore. It should be understood. This creates one of the most useful consumer exercises. Follow the money. Where did each component of the transaction go? What was paid directly to you? What was paid to someone else on your behalf? What charges were imposed as an incident to the extension of credit? Which charges were excluded from the finance charge? Which were treated as prepaid finance charges? And does the arithmetic reconcile with the disclosure? You are no longer asking only, what do I owe? You are also asking, how was this disclosure calculated? This is why the amount financed is an important audit point. Place the documents side by side. Examine the note. Examine the applicable truth in lending disclosures. For a mortgage transaction, examine the closing disclosure. Review the itemized charges. Identify the disclosed finance charge. Identify charges treated as prepaid finance charges. Then reconstruct the calculation. The objective is not to assume wrongdoing merely because two numbers differ. The objective is to determine why they differ and whether the disclosure follows Regulation Z. A difference between the note amount and amount financed is not automatically evidence of an error, but an unexplained difference deserves examination. The disciplined approach is simple. Trace the amounts, classify the charges, apply the regulatory calculation, reconcile the result. If the numbers match, you understand the transaction better. If they do not, you now have a specific disclosure issue to investigate. Instead of making an accusation, ask a precise accounting question. Please show me how the disclosed amount financed was calculated. Then go further. Which transaction components were included? Which were excluded? Which charges were classified as finance charges? Which were treated as prepaid finance charges? And can those figures be reconciled to the underlying closing documents? Specific questions produce far more useful information than assumptions. That is the consumer benefit of understanding the amount financed. A complicated credit transaction becomes something you can trace, something you can calculate, something you can reconcile, and something you can intelligently question when the numbers do not make sense. The disclosure stops being merely another number on another page. It becomes a map of the transaction. So the next time you see a loan, amount of $50,000, $100,000, or $300,000, do not assume that number standing alone answers every disclosure question. Find the amount financed. Examine how it was calculated. Compare it with the underlying transaction. And ask the question that turns a passive borrower into an informed consumer. How much credit did I actually receive? And how did you calculate that number? Because in consumer credit, the headline number tells you part of the story. The calculation tells you how the story was built. Know the note amount, know the charges, and most importantly, know how the numbers connect.